Benjamin and Luke, for those that haven't come across you online, introduce yourself and tell our listeners what we're talking about today.
I'm Luke Slindee. I'm a pharmacist. I'm very interested in pharmacy pricing and in particular understanding the entire pharmacy supply chain and where every dollar of each prescription ultimately goes with respect to the manufacturer, wholesaler, pharmacy, PBM, and plan. I have a background that includes independent pharmacy, chain pharmacy, and large health plan analytics.
I'm Benjamin Jolley. I'm a pharmacist in Salt Lake City, Utah. I work at an independent pharmacy, my family. I also have worked with hundreds of pharmacies across the country in understanding PBM contracting. In addition to that, I would classify myself as a proponent of the self-determination movement. Today, we're going to talk about monopoly power and, in particular, how the business model of a well-known monopoly, Amazon, is very similar to the pharmacy benefit managers, particularly the big three pharmacy benefit managers, and how there are a lot of parallels between what we experience in pharmacy and what folks in other industries like chicken farming experience.
Don't take that away from my audience. We just like to bitch about PBMs, and pharmacies have it the worst. Everybody in the world is picking on pharmacies, and we deserve all the sympathies of the whole world looking at what the big guys are doing to us. And you're telling me that other businesses have problems too that might be similar?
Yep, absolutely.
We're not going to feel special anymore.
That's, I guess, my whole thing is that we aren't. I mean, in some ways we are. Certainly no one else has a MAC list, right? No one else has a DIR fee. They don't use the same words, but the business model is extremely similar, and the abuses that other people experience are extremely similar. Instead of a DIR fee, you have a tournament system where you get paid a different rate depending on how heavy your chickens are. Or instead of a MAC price, you have fluctuating prices every day that are dictated by your trading partner. They don't use the same words, but the reason why it's important to me that we accept as an industry that we aren't unique is that the coalition of potential people that can influence public policy is so much bigger if we give up our uniqueness, as it were. I mean, there's certainly something to be said for that we should say we are unique and different, but consider that no one really cares. No politician really cares what 20,000 independent pharmacies think. They care what 4 million people think, right? Or enough people to swing an election. And if we can move the conversation about PBMs from being this weird thing that only pharmacists care about, from that to being a part of a much bigger picture concept of monopoly power generally, and the abuse of large corporations against smaller businesses and against the consumers, then we gain so much more influence, right? Because, again, 20,000 pharmacists that own pharmacies, maybe 300,000 pharmacists across the country, that's a tiny group. You bring in farmers, you bring in people who sell on Amazon, you bring in all of these other people who experience the same problems, you're talking about millions, tens of millions of people. That's the kind of stuff that the President of the United States listens to. That's what the Senate listens to. They listen when you've got a big movement. And 300,000 people ain't it.
I can prove that no one gives a crap about pharmacists because maybe my ears will perk up a little bit if I hear about something that's been in the news before, coal miners, or I hear about maybe chicken farmers because I've seen the documentary where these guys got together in the middle of the night and things like that. Maybe some of those I have sympathies for, but there's 100 other industries where there's little guys and I just don't give a crap. Maybe I would give a crap if I saw a story on it or something, but I don't even want to take the time to listen to the story. I'm like, fend for yourself. We do. If finally have so much sympathy to go around. So it's a great point that once you get past that hurdle of saying no one really cares in the industry to industry, but when you bring all these industries together that all feel like they're getting screwed, then you've got a big movement.
Exactly. Yeah. So what brought this up, where you and I connected this last time, was I wrote an article on my blog that I entitled Amazon as a PBM. My point was not that Amazon is literally a pharmacy benefits manager. They're not.
Sure.
My point was that the business model that Amazon has on Amazon Marketplace is the same kind of business model that Express Scripts and Caremark have on Pharmacy Benefit Manager. It's putting yourself in the middle of a transaction and extracting rents.
Rents?
Right. In economic terms, a economic rent is basically anything that you extract more than the value that you provide. And generally that's through like a information asymmetry, like a PBM, for example, can extract a substantial amount of value from the system by exploiting the difference in pricing knowledge between them and their client. Similarly, a pharmacy can extract an economic rent by, filling a prescription that costs them $50, but they sell it for several thousand. Those concepts of where you are extracting more value than you're providing, that's an economic rent.
And usually that's because of some shift in power, which to me, the power seems like it's the power of mystery, of smoke and mirrors. That's got to be a big part of even the two that I'm hearing you right now when I think of even in pharmacy, selling something for 100 times the cost. Probably wouldn't happen if there was knowledge of that happening.
It's not just knowledge, it's also a lack of viable alternatives. So that's kind of where the whole concept around monopoly, or a broader term that's probably more accurate, is concentrated economic power. And there's a direct relationship between the number of individual firms in a market and the power that each firm has. And the fewer firms there are in a market, the more difficult it is for small businesses to compete in any market, and also the less incentive that each individual firm has to treat their customers and also their employees appropriately. So, one example that I could throw out there that is, an extreme oversimplification, but in the pharmacy space, if let's just pretend that Walgreens and CVS were literally the only pharmacies. There was no independent pharmacies, no specialty pharmacies, no mail order. This is purely hypothetical. But if there's only two pharmacies and you're a pharmacy graduate, you only have the ability to work for one of two companies. And it really removes any incentive for them to treat you decently as an employee, because Walgreens could treat you poorly, and then you're just going to, your only other alternative is to work for CVS. Well, they know that in a game theory scenario, so they can also treat their employees terribly. And so it's kind of a race to the bottom with respect to how employees are treated. And then also the same metrics apply to consumers as well. So if those two companies are the only two places where people can receive their prescriptions, they don't really have much of an incentive to actually provide good customer service, because where else are you going to go? The other guy is also terrible. So this is just a very general problem across any marketplace, that when there's too few firms involved in a market supply chain, you almost always see these trends of customer service gets a lot worse. The economic liberty of the customer to do what they want to do is decreased. And then inevitably, employees of those firms end up getting treated poorly as well.
There must be some magic for how many companies it takes to break that. More than one, and a few. Is there a magic number to that?
It depends on the industry, right? You don't need 100 different manufacturers of amlodipine, right? There are about 15, and the price of amlodipine has crashed through the floor as a result, right? Versus if you look at, the generic drug market to me is a great example of this phenomenon. The more companies that are producing a drug, the lower its price goes. And amlodipine is wholesales now for less than a penny a tablet, versus the whole design of the generic drug market is that you have you give exclusivity to the first company to come to market. And like, if you looked at Truvada, a year ago it was brand only, and it wholesaled for $1,800 a bottle. In November of last year, the first generic came to market, and the price of per bottle dropped for that generic to, I think, $1,300 a bottle, and it stayed there for 6 months. So Gilead had full market power. They had literally monopoly on the market. And then Teva came in with their generic. They have substantial market power because they're the only generic firm. They still have to sell it at a discount relative to Truvada, or no one would buy it. But then in April, 11 companies jumped into the market, and the price dropped to, the last I checked, $14 a bottle. I mean, this is the impact of going from one company in a market to going to 11. And apparently there's still enough margin for those 11 companies to be profitably producing this drug. And so, like, that the difference there between that $14 a bottle, which is presumably the market clearing price, and the $1,400 a bottle, that's the economic rent that you obtain through the market power, which in this case is granted directly by the government. It's a sanctioned, legitimate monopoly, because we want to incentivize people to come to market with new generics.
The thing is you actually need to reapply this lens to every step in the drug supply chain, right? So it's not just manufacturers; it actually applies to every link. And so, rough numbers, if you look at the most concentrated link in the pharmacy supply chain right now, it's actually the wholesaler market, where 3 firms, and you know their names, control over 95% of that market. And so that is a situation where we have a very small number of firms that are exerting extreme market power, and there are lots of effects that become of that. Now, alternatively, if you look at other links in the supply chain, there are 3 firms on the PBM side that control somewhere between 75 and 85% of the market. So still a very concentrated marketplace, but not as concentrated as the wholesaler market. And I would argue that a lot of the plight of the independent pharmacist is that you are effectively a relatively small entity that is dwarfed on either side of the supply chain, the wholesaler on one side, the PBM on the other. And those are markets that are incredibly dominated by a small number of very giant firms, and pharmacies effectively get crushed between 2 giant boulders.
Does a consumer suffer when you've taken away too many monopolies, when you've made it too small and you've allowed now 800 wholesalers and, 1 million PBMs? Is there a point where the consumer suffers on the low end, no longer on the high end, because there's too few companies?
So first of all, consumer, I don't like that to be the be-all, end-all measure of monopoly, because frankly, the concept of the consumer welfare standard is the reason why we're in this situation we are today. In theory, and if you accept the consumer welfare standard, the whole concept is that if you have too much competition, too many competitors, then prices will be higher because each of those companies has to have a minimum margin to maintain to be profitable.
I gotcha.
But the last 40 years of concentration, I think, is evidence that that concept is bogus. Because yes, you might get lower prices by letting one PBM run everything and tell all the pharmacies and all of the manufacturers that you're going to stick to my formulary and you're going to accept the prices that I dictate. But price is not everything, right? We talked about other harms that we see when there's a monopoly market, or too much concentrated power. You see abuses of employees, which means customer service suffers. You see abuses of suppliers, which means that the quality of the supplies going in is lower. I mean, when you look at the generic drug market, it's really good at lowering prices because you have these three wholesalers that have 95% market power and therefore are buying everything from all of these manufacturers. And so the price becomes so low that the only companies that can compete are those that are willing to cut corners. And so when you look at the generic drug market today, where is all of it made? It's all made in China and India because they have the lowest marginal cost of labor. And also they're willing to play games to buy markets. There is a point where price becomes too low and there's too many suppliers, but I think that that's mainly caused by a dominant firm in a different step of the supply chain extracting value.
A lot of it is what's the definition of how the consumer is really helped. And I'm sure that's across the board in people's ideas.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head. And that actually dovetails really nicely with the change of definition of antitrust, which Benjamin was kind of alluding to. So there's been a long history with respect to how the federal government has treated antitrust regulation. And so prior to around 1980, the main interpretation of antitrust was to look at it as like a multifaceted thing, right? So it was to say, we've recognized that when markets become overly concentrated and too few firms control too much of the marketplace, that all kinds of these negative things start happening across different metrics. So people get treated worse as employees. Customers have less say in which business they are able to buy their product from and stuff like that. It is there, history has borne out that whenever we have overly concentrated markets, there are all kinds of different problems that arise, and they tend to affect each one of us in each different capacity that we serve in. So any one person, it's not realistic to think of people only as consumers, because we all wear multiple hats in our daily life, right? We are employees, we are members of our community, we are family members. We all do lots of things. We're not just consumers. And so when you're trying to understand how to regulate a market to avoid overconcentration, you need to understand the ways that will affect everyone in all of those different capacities. There was kind of a sea change in the 1980s that occurred where they started to look at everything solely through the lens of price and focusing on thinking of people solely as consumers. And so then everything became about efficiencies. And that was the argument that large organizations would be able to apply economies of scale to drive efficiencies, which would then result in lower prices for consumers. And if we're solely looking at everything through the lens of price, lower prices is better, right? That's why we have Walmart. That's why we have Amazon. A lot of these businesses and a lot of people, they look at that and they only look at things through the lens of themselves as a consumer, and they could say, yeah, this is great, but they're not looking at the effect that it's having on them as trying to be an employee. And they're not looking at the effect of it's having on their community that they live in and the social ties that tie that community together. So, really you need to look at this as through a comprehensive lens, and not, price is one of the factors. It's important, of course, but it's just one of many things you need to consider.
What Luke was describing, the prior doctrine before the 1980s and really before 1978, the doctrine of antitrust enforcement was called harmful dominance, meaning basically that we will break up any company that becomes so dominant that they are harming other people in the supply chain, whether that be their competitors, whether that be their suppliers, whether that be their customers. And it's actually fascinating to me if you look at the antitrust guidelines that the Carter administration had. They specifically said that a merger between a company with a 10% market share and a company with a 1% market share was presumptively illegal. That is such a foreign concept today. or that a merger between a company with a 5% market share and another company with a 5% or greater market share was presumptively illegal. It was presumed that if you were trying to merge two companies like that, it was not to benefit anyone except yourself.
Just with 10% of the market, that was not where they wanted to go.
Yes, that was presumptively illegal, and basically the onus was on the business to prove that they were not breaking antitrust law. In 1978, Robert Bork, the judge he wrote a book entitled The Antitrust Paradox, A Policy at War with Itself, basically arguing that the point of antitrust was to benefit consumers and that only. There was no other purpose of the law, and that any other interpretation of the law was total garbage. So he wrote that in 1978. The next year, the Supreme Court started citing it in cases that were brought by the Department of Justice trying to break up companies or trying to block mergers. And then the next administration, Reagan, his antitrust assistant attorney general named Baxter rewrote antitrust law to conform to Robert Bork's view of the world. He rewrote all of the policies to say that basically we presume that mergers are pro-competitive, and so now it's on the government to prove that your merger is illegal rather than on you to prove that it's legal, right? And that's a massive change in how the enforcement went. And so you went from, in the Carter administration, there were like 300 cases brought saying this is an illegal merger, to in the Reagan administration, there were like 10. And so mergers started to become just a way of life, and that you can draw a straight line from the Reagan administration to today of increasing concentration in every industry.
I know that we've talked that there's other things besides price involved. Luke, you were mentioning about the workers and the community and things like that. I know there's more to it than low prices, but in general, it would seem to me that mergers and acquisitions, the price drops to make it look good for the government and so on, and then they start to creep up because they have that monopoly. Is that not a broad enough thought on my part? Is that commonly what happens?
I mean, basically, yeah. What really happens is that since that book was written by Robert Bork, the guidelines basically require the government to produce these extremely complex economic models showing that you're going to harm consumers. And there are plenty of economists out there in the world that are willing to develop an economic model for the merging companies, showing that, it's totally fine that Fox and Disney merge because prices will go down. See, here's this model that proves it. Prices go up later, but no one really cares because the model was what was in the courtroom and what allowed it to go through. And so basically under the current standard, which is that consumer welfare standard, has been since the 80s, you're asking judges to make a prediction about what will happen, rather than asking judges to make a judgment about the facts of the case as they actually are. And so that to me is a fundamental error, because it's not a judge's job to predict the future. Anyone who tries to predict the future knows the saying that he who lives by the crystal ball often has to eat broken glass, because it's impossible to predict the future, right? But when we transition to this consumer welfare standard, we expected judges to somehow become these like super economists that first of all understand what these models say, which is difficult for even really intelligent economists. And then also to understand, to be able to predict the future and say, yes, I think that the model as you've described it actually does predict what will happen in the future.
My guess is since the low prices come first and quickly, that's the easier one to predict, and thus cases go that way.
Yeah. And usually you'll see some, like you described, a lower price initially, and then the prices will go up. But I mean, with a big company, you don't necessarily even have to raise prices, right? if you do a merger and you're able to fire half of your employees, or you do a merger and suddenly, instead of being the 30% market share, you're now the 80% market share, then you can extract all of the price difference out of your supplier, right? Suppose a counterfactual here. Instead of there being 3 big wholesalers, there's like 1 million wholesalers, and there's one huge pharmacy chain. That pharmacy chain can go to any of those wholesalers and say, look, I'm going to need you to work for like, I don't know, a penny a bottle to ship me all of the product. And then they're able to maintain the price the same, but extract a higher profit by abusing their suppliers. And that's honestly the way that we see things actually have happened. Like that is Walmart's whole business model, is to lower prices below the regular market clearing price and then extract the difference out of the people who make it, which has all sorts of downstream effects. It means that we ship a ton of jobs to China.
Where we started this off was saying that people don't care about individual businesses. They don't care about just pharmacy. It takes a group of all these thinkers together. That's where the power is, with all these companies talking about this. But it doesn't necessarily go talking about the consumer. That's not necessarily the end point. That power stops with a bunch of business people in different industries talking about the effects of their industry, of their employers and owners and consumers, but not necessarily just consumers.
Yes. And Luke mentioned also as a member of the community. And I think I'd like to point out just some concepts about that from my perspective. So let's take the state of Indiana. In Indiana, and in most of the country, most small towns, most cities receive most of their revenue to operate the city's infrastructure from property tax, right? And one of the impacts that large businesses, particularly big boxes like Target, like Walmart, and so forth have, is that they put up these, basically prefabricated big boxes, and then eventually that store closes, right? They build a bigger one down the road. But they either maintain the lease on that property that's now closed, or they sell it to someone with a restrictive covenant saying you cannot use this for retail. You can use it for, I don't know, an amusement park or something like that.
A church.
Or a church. So I'm Walmart. I just have a Walmart. And then I decide to open a Walmart Supercenter down the road. I don't want any Target opening in that old Walmart, right? And so I say to the person who buys the building from me that you can't use it for retail. There's a restrictive covenant built into the purchase agreement. So what that does is, down the line, that means that now that this building is closed and has basically no tax value. It's the property value of that property is practically nil now, right?
Because if it's empty, no one's paying tax on it?
Well, they are paying tax, but like the assessment of its value, right? The tax assessor comes in and says, I think this building's worth $18 million. And you say, I'm not doing anything with this. It's just a hunk of junk. I think it's worth $5.
At that point, it's only worth that because no one's buying it.
Right. And so, like, if I sell this to someone else, they're going to buy it for like $100,000. They're not going to buy it for $18 million.
Gotcha.
And so what the large chain stores, and I believe in particular, this is Target, for example, what they've done, that their smart lawyers will sue a city's tax assessor and say, yeah, so you valued our building at $20 million because, it's an open store, there's lots of business running through it, and that's about what it costs to build. But I don't think it's worth that. I think it's worth what this store that's closed is worth, and so
it's a downward spiral.
My tax assessment should really be, $500,000 instead of $20 million. And so now the city's ability to extract taxes to support the infrastructure for the entire city And particularly just for, say, that Walmart or that Target, they're now not able to extract the taxes that they need to be able to just maintain the plumbing to that building, right? Or the road to that building, or the police. And so one of the impacts of this focus on consumer value only, like consumer welfare, is that we ignore the impacts on small towns of having gigantic companies that have lawyers whose job is just to reduce their tax bill, right? If it's just a mom and pop, you don't have the money to pay a lawyer to go sue the city to come up with this fancy theory that your building isn't worth anything.
Right.
Right? I don't have that kind of money. And the savings to me is like, several $1,000s. It's not enough to pay a lawyer. And so one of the impacts of concentrated market power is that your city doesn't get enough money to fund the roads, and suddenly you end up with Flint, Michigan with no water because their water's, because the water lines haven't been replaced in 70 years because we don't have the taxes to bring in because the big boxes have such concentrated market power. So no individual in society is purely a consumer.
That's a great example, Benjamin, because when you say it's not just consumers, then my mind automatically goes to, all right, it's the workers. Well, too bad. The workers have to up their game and go to college and get better jobs and all that kind of stuff. But the stuff you're talking about, it's like, it's in the DNA of this thing. It's like it hurts everybody and as a whole.
The larger the organization, it's an extractive relationship where they show up to your town and they extract as much value that they can out of your town. That money then gets shipped elsewhere to like wherever the corporate headquarters is or wherever their, stockholders live or any of that kind of stuff. And then a lot of these relationships are abusive in the way that Benjamin just described. So a lot of times the cities end up getting the real short end of the stick when it comes to this. So the big businesses, and this is also true if you really think about it from a perspective of any kind of a mail order business like Amazon too, because when we purchase things through the mail, again, all of our dollars are leaving our household and going somewhere else, and they're not coming back to the city. Now, let me flip that, an alternative, right? So I've never been to Benjamin's neighborhood, but I'm going to make some assumptions.
It's probably a gated. He probably wouldn't let you in anyways, Luke.
His family has owned his pharmacies, and the buildings in which his pharmacies are in are generally viewed as being community assets. They are providing a service to the community, and also in the terrible situation where if they needed to close one of their pharmacies, I'm assuming that they're in the opposite situation where their building could probably very easily get transferred into something else, some other kind of small business, in a way that a large big box retailer absolutely cannot. So then you have that fact where you're basically maintaining the built environment, even if the pharmacy isn't in existence anymore. While the pharmacy is in existence, they are the owners of that pharmacy. And so any of the profits that get accrued to that pharmacy are going to be spent in the town in which they live. I think people understand this at a very basic level, but when you start to really look out to the second and the third order effects of what really this happens, we really need to take this into consideration. So a really strong reason to fight monopoly power is that we want to fight that extractive relationship with our environments and that we live in, literally our communities. That we're running out of money to have things like Little League and an ice skating rink and all these things that really have a big effect on quality of life. Meanwhile, the other version of that, where we have a distributed market where there's all kinds of firms and people are utilizing small businesses, that money is staying in town. It has a huge effect on the way we all live our lives.
Is there any way for town leaders to say, all right, well, maybe we haven't or we're not going to keep out this monopoly, but here's what we can do? How can they not have that money going elsewhere? I'm sure there's taxes and fees and things like that. Is there anything workable once these places are already in a town?
You can definitely start by not giving them like incentives, right? So that's, we want to bring it back to Amazon think about that ridiculous situation that we had where they basically put out a call to say, hey, where are we going to have our HQ2? And all of these cities basically just prostrated themselves before Amazon, and they said, we'll give you millions of dollars, and we'll give you all this free land, and we'll do anything you want. That's such an abusive relationship. Cities should not be in that environment. So, they think that they might be generating economic activity and getting jobs, but it is a devil's bargain. I promise you that. So, if anything, I would just start with not giving any economic incentives to a large organization to bring their business to your town.
I'm a young pharmacist listening to this, and I say, all right, Luke and Benjamin, fine. Eventually it's going to hurt the city, but I'm going to be out of this city in a couple years, whatever. But at least I get really low prices on Amazon Prime because they're a monopoly and they're giving me the lowest prices there are.
I guess I'll just respond to that concept. First of all, I don't think you need to feel guilty about buying stuff from dominant firms. The another impact of this consumer welfare standard has been that we've internalized this concept that the only way that we can influence change in the world is by boycotting big companies or by boycotting companies that we don't like. That's absolutely not the case, right? We can be politically active. We can talk to our city leaders like we were just describing, saying, hey, let's not give money to Amazon to build a gigantic warehouse in just right next to the Salt Lake City airport. I think they gave them over $1 billion of tax incentives. It makes me sick. Basically, the city completely funded the building of this gigantic warehouse so that Jeff Bezos can have another yacht. Anyway, but we don't have to feel guilty about buying from them because we live in a world where they exist. It is okay for you to buy stuff from Amazon and still think that Amazon is terrible and should be broken up. It is okay. It's okay to spend money in companies that you do not like. That is okay because it's pointless to try to boycott a company unless it's part of a larger political movement. Okay, unless it's you and a lot of other people boycotting them at the same time to get something very specific done. I want wages to go up. I want this company broken up. I want you to pledge to stop, I don't know, cutting down palm in the Philippines. Unless your boycott is targeted to a specific political end, it's pointless.
If you looked where everybody had their fingers in and then looked at your 401k and who owned what and this and that, you'd have to live naked in a cave, basically. You couldn't live in the society. There's too many tentacles everywhere.
In particular, Amazon is a gigantic conglomerate. They have Amazon, which sells you stuff online. They have Amazon Marketplace, which lets other people sell you stuff online. They have Amazon Web Services, which basically runs the entire internet.
Including maybe this conversation.
Probably.
Exactly. Yes.
And so it would be absolutely inane to try and cut off your life from Amazon while they are still so big, right? And so we have to come to terms with it's okay to use these services and advocate that this thing is wrong. Because this consumer welfare standard has made people internalize that their only role in society is a consumer. But that's not your role in society. And as Cory Doctorow puts it on his blog pluralistic.net, great website, by the way, you are not a consumer. You're not an ambulatory wallet that votes for things by buying or not buying. You are a citizen, and you can ask for your government to intervene on your behalf, and you should, right? The problem with concentrated market power is, there's all sorts of them, but in particular, it's that the power of a large company becomes comparable or bigger than that of the government.
Sometimes they're referred to as private governments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and to me, the hallmark of a company that is too big is if they can impose taxes. In pharmacy, we call these taxes DIR fees, right? They are a tax that is imposed by a dominant market player on the smaller market player. In Amazon, they call them Amazon seller fees. They call them fulfillment by Amazon. Another example is software development. I have an iPhone right here. Every app that sells into the Apple App Store has to give a cut of their proceeds to Apple, about 30%. The average company that is selling on Amazon Marketplace, when they win that buy box that says buy now, about 30% of that goes back to Amazon on average. And like you see this over and over and over and over again. If a company can extract taxes out of people to be able to run their business, they're a monopoly. That to me is the definition of a monopoly in very gross terms. Like, I can't impose a tax on my customers. I can try to raise my prices, but it doesn't really have much of an impact because I have this dominant market player dictating my prices to me. When I say that a company is able to extract a tax, Amazon is a phenomenal example of this. Amazon reserves the right to remove your product listing if you list it somewhere else on the internet for less money. So, I mean, that's extremely similar to the way that the pharmacy benefit management market works, right? You have to have a usual and customary price that you submit. And if you sell it at a lower price to a cash-paying customer, you're in violation of contract. And they reserve the right to audit you on that. Amazon is able to therefore enforce that the price on Amazon is the lowest price that you can buy on the internet. But that really means that the price elsewhere is higher because of Amazon.
The reason they're the lowest price is because they don't allow lower prices anywhere. They're the lower price just because there's no one else that's allowed to lower it.
Right. Like if I'm, say, I don't know, a supplement company and I sell on Amazon and I also sell on my own website, I have to raise my prices to pay Amazon their 30% cut on Amazon.
That's fascinating.
And so my prices on my website would, say, in a functional market that didn't have Amazon in it, would be, say, $10 a bottle. But because they're taking 30%, I got to factor that into my price point. So I'm going to charge $15 on Amazon and on my website.
They've almost raised the world's prices on certain categories, if not all categories, because of that.
Yes. Walmart does the same thing, right? They market themselves as the bargain basement place, right? And they also extract these discounts out of their suppliers, right? If you want to be displayed on their shelf space, you pay Walmart for that shelf space at the front of the store. You pay them 20% of sales or something for the right to put your product in the front of the store.
I know there's a couple different interactions here, but it sounds a lot like the PBMs, you know, how the customer's paying this higher amount and Walmart's getting this lower amount because of the placement.
It's just like a formulary placement, right?
It sure sounds like that, yeah.
I mean, the same thing with the Amazon buy box, right? You get in the buy box by paying Amazon a higher advertising fee, which is really just the same as a formulary rebate in pharmacy.
Yeah, so Walmart's not passing that along. They're getting it and the consumer's paying higher.
Yeah, it's the same concept. Like when we talk about formularies in pharmacy, like, oh, that's a nice Trulicity you've got there. It'd be a shame if I only covered Victoza, right? That's a real nice product you got there. It'd be a shame if no one ever saw it because it's on the 4th page of Amazon's results.
Right.
Right. You got to pay me or else no one's ever going to buy your product.
Right.
The textbook example of this in the pharmacy space is the self-introduced insulin generics, right? So both Lilly and Novo Nordisk basically got tired of paying the rebate game to get on the formulary for their respective insulin products, and so they self-introduced their own generics at like half half of the list price of what the insulins were, and a lot of the PBMs still excluded them from the formulary. I mean, they effectively said, I don't care if it's half the price. You're not allowed to even be there. So it's exactly like what we're talking about in the retail space, where it's like, if you don't play by their rules, they make you disappear, basically.
We don't carry any brand names in our pharmacy anymore. And I don't carry any insulin in my store. And it sounds absurd to be sitting here talking about it, that I don't carry any insulins, but you got the brand names that they're cutting way down. And then all of a sudden this generic comes out and, the customers can't get it. It's excluded. Even if we did give it to them, we'd still have to play the same brand name pricing games and stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So it's fun to bitch about our own industry. And now we can even bitch about all the industries. Is there any hope in this, though?
There is. And that's, part of the reason why it's kind of exciting to have this conversation is that there has been an ideological shift that's occurred at the federal level. And probably the biggest signpost of that, or signal, was the nomination of Lina Khan as the FTC chair. And she...
A young gal.
Yes. And someone who has been very, very critical of the overly concentrated markets and the ways that they abuse that power, and someone very aware of the history of the regulation of antitrust and, kind of this 100+ year cycle that we've been on in terms of different ways of managing antitrust. And so there's been a ton of positive developments, including open meetings, where now for the first time, because of Zoom and those type of technologies, they're actually allowing the public to view their meetings, which is unprecedented. And they're also taking public feedback. So our very own Benjamin was one of the first people to take advantage of that. And he was able to record a 30-second statement.
I saw that. They gave you a full minute, didn't they, Benjamin?
I think my statement ended up being 52 seconds, actually.
There we go.
But yeah, they gave me up to a full minute, and then they were going to just cut me off. So I practiced it multiple times beforehand, and I was like, I wrote this whole page-long thing, and then I had to boil it down to 3 sentences. But yeah, there is hope, is the main thing, right? That we can see the light at the end of this dark, dark tunnel of corporate concentration. It's not a sure thing, and it requires political will, and it requires political organizing. But the appointment of Lina Khan was first a business journalist. She went in and interviewed small business people all over the country, asked them what was wrong in their industry, and then she went to law school. And while she was in law school, she wrote this article called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, in a nice little jab at Robert Bork's Antitrust Paradox, the book, and basically said that under the consumer welfare standard, you can't prosecute Amazon. They are not breaking antitrust law under that standard, meaning that the standard is totally bogus because Amazon is totally a monopoly. You ask any person on the street and they're like, and say, is Amazon a monopoly? It's obvious.
But the loopholes in that are such that they're not officially breaking it.
Right. Under the economic models of this consumer welfare standard, you can't prove that Amazon is doing anything wrong under that doctrine, which means the doctrine is flawed. That was in 2017. She wrote that article, graduated law school that same year, and now this year she gets appointed as the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. That's a quick story from graduating law school to 4 years later being the chair of the FTC, but it's totally deserved.
Wow.
And she is a brilliant lawyer. And also, she was a journalist. She went and interviewed people. She gets it. And so after she was appointed FTC chair, the Biden administration actually put out an executive order saying basically every single level of government, the Defense Department, everyone else, I want you to stop buying from your big one supplier. And I want you to enforce the antitrust law. I want you to source things from smaller companies wherever possible, basically. Because the procurement that the government goes through has also become concentrated, because the way that we won World War II was we had literally thousands of companies that produced all of the defense stuff that we produce. Today there's like 3 companies that dominate the entire industry. Raytheon, Lockheed, and I don't remember the other one. I'm not in defense.
General Dynamics.
Yeah. And so we've gone from this situation where during World War II and under the antitrust enforcement of the FDR administration, we basically forced the government to get really, really good at procurement. In the 90s under Clinton, the Secretary of Defense told all of these suppliers, basically, the Cold War's over, merge or die. And so they merged. And now we've got like 3 suppliers, maybe 1 for a lot of the stuff that the government buys. Like, we can't rebuild our nuclear arsenal because there's only 1 company that knows how to do it, and so they get to dictate the price. We can't build a jet that is functional because we are so reliant on these big companies. The government procurement officers have gotten bad at writing what they want. When there were lots of suppliers, they had to say, I want this exactly, and they had to have really detailed specs for what they wanted. Now they say, I want this, and then the cost goes into the ceiling. And like, this happens again and again across industries, that the government has been spending money on like a couple of companies. I mean, Medicare Part D is a great example of this. The entirety of Medicare Part D is like 90% of all of the enrollees are with like 5 companies. They offer a lot of products, and Medicare Part D is for the most part a success, but it's also extremely concentrated to just a couple of companies. And that's in part because the government has chosen to source things from only a couple of companies.
Devil's advocate. All right, good luck, guys. You're fighting against the biggest companies on the planet that have the most money because of their monopolies, and they're buying off nearly everybody in Washington who is needed to make these changes. Now what?
I mean, we need a political revolution. We need a political participation revolution, really. I mean, first of all, we need people to understand the effect that antitrust has on their daily lives, which is significant, and, to express the fact that they want the government to basically hold the, private power into check. We've reached a point where private companies are, in a lot of cases, more powerful than the government. It should not be that way. We need to enforce the laws that have been on the books since 1914 and, do all of that. It is very exciting. One thing I want to really stress is that this, in this age of, unfortunately, a very polarized political environment across the 2 major political parties, this lack of antitrust enforcement and all the subsequent effects of it is a bipartisan failure. Like, this is something that has occurred for the last 40 years under both Democrat and Republican administrations, and they both have equally failed on this measure. And it seems like, we're very early in the process, but it seems like the people that are interested in turning this ship around also are coming at it from a bipartisan perspective. And so, even though obviously the current administration belongs to one party, there's no reason why this has to be a partisan issue. It really is an economic liberty issue. And, people should be able to shop and have lots of options when they want to buy something, and not be, not told by what the one company or the 2 companies that provide something that they have to buy it from them. Look at the pharmacy space and the steering and whatnot. I don't need a PBM telling me what pharmacy I have to go to. That's a loss of economic liberty, and everyone should care about that, regardless of your political affiliation. So at this point, I think we're really hitting the pendulum swing where, the proverbial phrase, it's always darkest before the dawn. You look in the pharmacy space and take a look at the Fortune 20. There's a lot of names that we know there. And I would say a lot of them, it seems kind of ridiculous why the company that does what they do, they should not be in the Fortune 20. So, we need to raise awareness. I'd really recommend that people read. There's been a whole collection of excellent books that have come out on this subject in the last couple of years. I would say Break 'em Up by Zephyr Teachout was very good. Goliath by Matt Stoller. Liberty from All Masters by Barry C. Lynn is another good one. Monopolized by David Dayen. These are all books that Benjamin and I have read, and I think it's a really great way of helping somebody have the context to understand what's going on in the pharmacy space so that we are not alone, as we've been talking about during this entire podcast. This is a problem that's plaguing every industry, and we just happen to see the particular manifestations of it in our industry. And so this is a great political movement that's just taken off. The train's leaving the station, so I'd say everybody's welcome. Let's get on board.
Yeah.
I like what you said, Benjamin, about the boycotts. And sometimes those boycotts, unless it's for a purpose with a ton of people, sometimes those boycotts can hurt because I feel like I'm doing my part by not buying, a pack of bubble gum from Walmart or something like that. But instead of easing your conscience that way, say, no, I'm going to buy that bubble gum, but I'm going to do something proactive that might have more impact.
If I might suggest something that you could do, like Luke mentioned, read a book. Go buy Matt Stoller's Goliath. Phenomenal book. One of the theses that he has at the beginning of his book is that the revolution in the 80s that transitioned us to the world that we're in today was so thorough that we lost the words to describe our reality. And so reading these books and reacquainting ourselves with the vocabulary that our great-grandparents had back in the 40s is really important. It's a really important first step. Another that I would suggest is look at who's running for office and vote for people who consistently are in favor of greater antitrust enforcement. I will say for me, there's two people in particular. One is that I want to get out of office, and one that I want to get into office. Mike Lee is my senator here in Utah. He's up for election this year. I want him out of office because he is a true believer in the consumer welfare standard. He wrote the foreword for the republication of the antitrust paradox. I want him out of office simply for that. I also don't really like him for a lot of other reasons, but that's whatever. But I'm putting my personal efforts into electing one of the wonderful people that are running against him. There's two, Ali Isom being one. The other is, on the other end of the spectrum, is this extremely bright young man in Missouri named Lucas Kunce. Lucas Kunce is running for senator for Roy Blunt's seat. It's an extremely contested seat. There's like 20 people that are running for it. Lucas, though, he's an Afghan war vet, an Iraq war vet, and he gets the idea. When he shipped out to Afghanistan for the first time, he left from Jefferson City, Missouri. There were corner grocery stores in his town. There aren't anymore because of the monopoly power that we see. And he gets this. He actually works currently for a group called the American Economic Liberties Project, whose work I think you should totally look at. It's phenomenal. But there's this resurgence of interest, and Luke mentioned that this is a bipartisan concept, and it totally is. If you look at Lena Khan's confirmation, she was confirmed by 75 senators. Out of that means that 25 Republicans voted for her because they see the problem in the world that is monopoly. They see, like, the most obvious ones are Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Once you get the concept that this is the problem is monopoly power, it's everywhere.
Someone's listening to this, and you're going to get their attention for 3 to 5 minutes after this as they're walking into their store or home or parking and they're on their mobile phone or something like that. the question to both of you individually, Luke and Benjamin. What do you want someone to do with those 3 minutes after hearing this? You don't get a lot of time for 3 minutes. It might be signing up for a blog or, listening. You could listen to Benjamin 3 times in a row for his FTC conversation he had for those 3 minutes. But what are they going to do with those 3 minutes?
Sign up for Matt Stoller's blog, Big. It's mattstoller.substack.com. Just sign up for his newsletter on your email. He sends a newsletter about once a week and just talks about this stuff. And he links to all sorts of other things in the same subject. But it's a great read every week about what kinds of things have happened in this space.
Luke, what's your 3-minute proposal?
Contemplate your personal relationship with Fortune 500 companies and how much control they have over your life, and contemplate whether or not you're comfortable with the current amount of control that they exist over your life. And if you're not, what are you going to do about it?
Benjamin and Luke, golly, thanks for your time. That was deep information. Pretty cool.
Thanks so much for your time, Mike. Like you say, it is deep. I think of this as, once you understand this, it's kind of like seeing the Matrix, right? You see the same problem everywhere else. So I'm just so grateful to be able to talk about it some more.
Really appreciate the platform. And, I challenge every pharmacist out there to really, consider the effects of this concentrated economic power and the effect that it's having on our industry. And then, as Benjamin said, try to find solidarity with other people, and let's make this a bigger group and expand the circle to all the other people that are feeling the pain as well.
For sure. Thanks, guys. We'll be watching closely.
Thanks so much, Mike. Have a great one.
Thank you.